It's so urgently important to be mindful about each moment and to structure the day so that you're not getting distracted by unproductive emotions and are focused on productive work. But it's the ancient wisdom that by being completely focused on basically being your best self every moment of the day, you can use your own talents to the best of their abilities, and in doing so, best achieve your potential and also serve others.
Prominent CEOs, leading economists, iconic investors. Insights from the experts. The Walker Webcast with Willy Walker. See who's next.
So, Jeff, I had a pretty busy week this past week because I had the Walker and Dunlop Summer Conference here with 650 people. And before they all arrived in town, I had to do a Walker Webcast with two writers for the Wall Street Journal on their book called The Formula, which is all about Formula One. So that was Monday. And then Tuesday, I had Barry Sternlicht, who went to Brown undergrad and Harvard Business School and is viewed as probably one of the most insightful and intelligent commercial real estate and private equity investors in the world to do homework on. And then the next day, I had Mohammed El Arian, who went to Cambridge undergrad. He went to Oxford for his master's and he went to Oxford for his PhD. Now is the president of Queen's College at Cambridge and stepped down from running PIMCO before he went and took that job. That was a lot of work. And so I get through those four and I said, I'm going to wait for Jeff until I'm done with Mohammed. I wake up the next morning after doing Mohammed and I see that Jeff has gone to Harvard, to Oxford, and to Yale. And I say, oh, I am. And so I have worked very hard, Jeff, to try and get up to speed on this. To anyone in here who is expecting me to try and ask Jeff the difference between Madison's philosophy and how Cicero influenced Madison versus Hamilton versus Jefferson, there's a lot of really good YouTube videos out there of experts from great universities who spent their entire career studying Madison and Hamilton and can do that much better than I. But I do want to do a little bit of a survey here, Jeff, to try and pull out of you and your writing in this book that sort of informs what I would call sort of the disciplined life. You talk in this book about deep reading. You talk in this book about lifelong learning. And I think everyone in this room is exemplary of those two things that came out as you were writing this book and researching this book. I want to back up for a second to start, though. You went to Dalton, to Harvard, to Oxford, and to Yale. At which one of those institutions did you learn the most?
It's all my mom and dad. And there's a moment.
You can't do that.
It's
you
true.
got to pick one of them.
Tell the truth.
I'm going to go back
you
to
ask me questions, and I'm going to speak the truth because that's what I'm here to do. 2 days ago, I was in my favorite building in Washington, D.C., the Library of Congress Jefferson Building. I think it's the most beautiful in all of Washington. And it was meaningful because I'd gone there with my mom when I was about 7 years old. And I distinctly remember being full of wonder at the thought that all of the books in the world were in that building. And last week, I looked at the legends on the ceiling. The fountain of wisdom flows through books. The great university of today is a collection of books. It's just a pay-in to reading. And I was talking to teachers there and expressed thanks to them for having inspired kids to learn about history. And I'm sharing this because that was the values that I grew up in. And my dad's most valuable possession was a hand-carved legend that I still have that his father wrote during the Depression. The fountain of wisdom flows through books. His dad was a peddler in Detroit, Michigan in the Depression, a Jewish refugee from the horrors of Europe. And the Detroit Public Library had just opened in 1932 with that phrase, the fountain of wisdom flows through books. And Manus Rosen, with his own hands, carved out this sentence. That's how much he loved learning. He didn't go to college or have even a high school education, but those were the values he gave to dad, and dad and mom gave them to me.
Start a legacy. Start turning dreams into realities. A better world begins with you. Better communities start with us.
You talk about your father. Your father died in 2022, just before this book was published. In the book, you talk about a number of people who, at various times, in times of great loss, Cicero into Jefferson into John Quincy Adams, went to read the great philosophers at their time of loss. Cicero read Pythagoras after losing his daughter. Jefferson read Cicero after losing his dad. John Quincy Adams read Cicero after losing his son. Where was it in your journey about losing your father that got you to go back and read, or how did losing your father as you were studying this play into that?
I lost my dad as I was turning in the book. And when I did, I realized that the central lesson that he had imbued was the one that I learned in this incredible journey of moral philosophy. My dad was a medical hypnotist. He was one of the great hypnotists of the 20th century. He studied with a founder of medical hypnotism called Milton Erickson, and he would always recite a phrase from Paracelsus, who was a 16th century mystic: "As we imagine ourselves to be, so shall we be." And that was the essence of his teaching about hypnosis. What I learned from my reading of Cicero and the classical moral philosophers is that that was also the central wisdom of the East and the West. We are what we think. Life is shaped by the mind, says the Dhammapada. Focus on the only thing we can control, which is our own thoughts and emotions, not the thoughts and emotion of others, say the Stoics. Renounce and enjoy, says Gandhi. Renounce attachment to external influences and enjoy eternal freedom. That central lesson, which is so pervasive in this classical moral philosophy, I hadn't experienced before. And since you ask, I'll just say how extraordinary it was to discover it based on this book by Cicero. And it was, I'll tell the story because this is why we're here. During COVID, I noticed that both Jefferson and Franklin had cited this book by Cicero that I'd never heard of as their central definition of the pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson, as you said, when he was old and people would ask him, what's the secret of happiness, would offer this passage from Cicero saying, "He who has achieved tranquility of soul, who's neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the wise man of whom we're in quest. He's the happy man." So I saw that and I thought, I've got to read this Cicero book. And then I noticed that Franklin had also chosen the same book as a motto for a project that he had in his 20s to achieve moral perfection by making a list of 13 virtues. So I said, I'm going to read Cicero. What else to read? And then I found this golden reading list that Jefferson would send to anyone who asked him how to be an educated person. And he'd send this to kids who were going to law school, who were sons of his friends, and he'd send them to his daughters. And it's an incredibly rigorous reading list, both in its scope and in its schedule. The scope includes literature and politics and science. And it also says that there's a rigorous schedule that you have to follow. You've got to get up before dawn, read 2 hours of moral philosophy, watch the sunrise. Then you can read political philosophy and law, then lunch, then science and astronomy, then dinner. Then you can have some Shakespeare and poems, and then to bed. 12 hours a day, no breaks, 7 days a week. So I saw this schedule, and then I saw this list of moral philosophy, and there at the top of the list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then these other great books of the Stoics and the Epicureans, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and Enlightenment philosophers like Locke and Hutcheson and Bolingbroke. And basically, I thought during COVID, I've got to read these books because it's a gap in my education. As you said, I've had this extraordinary education. And I am so grateful every day of my life for those remarkable teachers who inspired me to learn about political philosophy and law and history. And I name them because I'm so grateful to them and they transformed my life. But I just missed all of these books because moral philosophy fell out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 1980s. And I remember yearning for this kind of guidance in the 80s. It was the greed is good decade and you do you and, kind of Gordon Gekko. And I was studying Puritan theology in college, which was not doing it for me, I have to confess. both in its idea that you can only achieve salvation through God's randomly given grace and your unshaking faith, and also because I'm Jewish. And I was looking for an alternative to both the hedonism of pop culture and the rigors of Puritan theology. And what I didn't realize, because the answer was hiding in plain sight, is this is the answer the classical moral philosophy set out to answer. So when I found the books and saw Jefferson's reading list, I thought I got to read them. So it was COVID, and something came over me, and I decided to follow Jefferson's schedule. And I'd get up before dawn. I read for 2 hours in this amazing moral philosophy. I watched the sunrise. And I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I just read, which I know just sounds incredibly weird. And I still can't believe that I did it. But I was inspired. My wife, Lauren, is here. She's a poet, and she had kind of inspired me to try writing poetry. And that, combined with Jefferson and something else, led me to do this for a year. And that was the project. And I spent a year reading this moral philosophy, and it just transformed my life. It changed my understanding of how to be a good person, how to be a good citizen, and how to think about the founders and their relationship between personal self-government and political self-government. And it also changed the way I approach every day. So I'm this book is incredibly meaningful. I'm so excited to share it with you and with our friends. All of you are lifelong learners. You're all readers. That's why you're here. And I'm here as an evangelist for the power of lifelong learning and reading. And I'm so eager to share with you what I learned during my COVID summer vacation.
So when I saw that Jeff hadn't read any of those great philosophers, the Greek and Roman philosophers, in college, I said, whew, neither did I. And then I said, I've got 2 days to read them all. So Jeff, you talked about Cicero, but back to Pythagoras, because
Yes.
when you talk about Pythagoras, and I've listened to you talk about him, that Pythagoras is the one who really, first of all, he was a vegetarian before vegetarian was cool. Talk about Pythagoras and the discipline with which he lived his life and how Pythagoras then influenced Cicero.
He's so inspiring. So I thought of Pythagoras as the guy who invented the triangle and the harmonic system. If that weren't enough, Dayenu, But it turns out that in addition to that, he was a sage who lived on the Isle of Croton, inspired his disciples to first be good and then live like gods. His motto was reverence thyself. And it was Pythagoras who both came up with the idea of nightly self-accounting of our virtues, which inspired Franklin to come up with his famous project of daily self-accounting, and also came up with the distinction between reason and passion, which is the very core of Greek and Western moral philosophy. Pythagoras imagines that we have certain faculties or powers, reason in the head, passion or emotion in the heart, and also desire in the stomach, and says that it's our job to use our powers of reason to moderate or modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions so that we can achieve the calm tranquility that is embodied in the classical virtues of temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. And what's so core about Pythagoras, as you say, is that he lives his virtues, and he encourages and inspires rigorous moderation in eating and drinking. He's a very enthusiastic vegetarian. Ovid, in book 15 of the Metamorphoses, has this passage about Pythagoras' vegetarianism, which includes his peculiar exception for vegetarianism, an injunction against eating beans. You're really not allowed to eat beans. And in fact, his disciples were so committed not to eating beans that the enemy is chasing them and is about to kill them, and they come upon a bean field and they have to stop because they can't touch beans. And the enemy says, I'll spare you if you'll just tell one secret. Why won't you eat beans? And rather than tell the secret, they spit out their tongue and die, accept death on the bean field. So why on earth didn't they eat beans? There are two odd theses. One is that Lauren just discovered this in reading Iamblichus, Life of Pythagoras. One is that, beans cause flatulence, and by emitting the soul through an unwelcome orifice, then you taint the soul. And the other is that beans resemble fetuses. So it's either fetuses or farts. It's one or the other. But but no beans. Aside from that, a very rigorous vegetarianism. But he was like Jesus or Socrates, who were Franklin's models of how to live a perfect, balanced life. And he's also a practical inspiration for all of us, because you can never actually achieve perfection, but always through daily mindfulness, being really mindful of how you use your time, what you eat, and what you drink, you can first be good and then be like a god.
So let's fast forward about 500 years to Cicero. Was Cicero a better writer or orator?
Well, Cicero is not a romp, I have to confess. The Tusculan Disputations is incredibly inspiring and central to moral philosophy. But although the translation means so much, of course, he's most famous as a rhetorician, and kids in America and elsewhere would study his rhetoric for generations. And John Quincy Adams, who's in some ways the most inspiring of all the founders, relies on Cicero and makes him the center of his book on rhetoric, which is the first book in America published on rhetoric. So all this is to say his orations must be extraordinarily powerful, and when you read them out loud, they're really great.
His influence on the founding fathers, John Quincy Adams, as I read the book, Jeff, and listened to you talk about it subsequently, he's the one who really he was the most virtuous. Talk about why. I mean, you focus on Franklin, you focus on Jefferson, but John Quincy Adams, there's something about the way that he lived his life and his pursuit of virtue that made him rank highest amongst the founding fathers.
He's so inspiring because it's such a self-conscious effort to achieve self-mastery, and he comes closer than anyone else. So first of all, I thought having a Jewish mom could sometimes be a challenge. Imagine having a Puritan mom like Abigail Adams, because she's always exhorting him, use your powers of reason to master your passions. She loves to quote the proverb, he who is slow to anger is greater than he who's mastered a village, and is always telling Quincy to work harder and drink less and achieve more. And he internalizes this, and he's just a bundle of neurosis, basically. And there's at about the age of 30, he's just turned down a U.S. Supreme Court appointment. He's minister to St. Petersburg, and he writes in his diary, which is the most vivid and revealing of any American president, I'm 30-something years old. I haven't achieved anything. I'm a total failure. I'm spending too much time at the theater. I'm drinking too much. If I could only achieve self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery. He sets a very high bar for himself. Okay, so then he goes on, he's elected president in the close contest with Andrew Jackson, defeated by Jackson the second time around, and then he suffers another incredible tragedy, which is that his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide. And George Washington can't deal both with the burden of having that name, can you imagine? And also of Adams, who's wrote an entire book to him, letters from father to a Christian son, exhorting him to be as perfect as Jesus and to exemplifies self-mastery and virtue. He can't take it. He jumps off a steamship. Adams is crushed. He can't imagine how he'll continue. What does he do? He spends a year rereading Cicero in the original, in particular the Tusculan Disputations. And in the White House, he reads Cicero, gets up, writes sonnets against slavery, and watches the sunrise. It's just remarkable. So after this year of a kind of accounting of the soul, he reemerges and becomes the greatest opponent of slavery of any white man of his time, according to Frederick Douglass. And he's reelected to Congress as a representative from Massachusetts. He denounces the gag rule forbidding abolitionist petitions from being introduced. He introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery. And he dies on the floor of the House. He dies on the floor of the House. And his last words are, I am composed. And that's from Cicero. Because remember the line that Jefferson would share with anyone saying, what's the meaning of happiness? The perfectly composed person who's achieved a tranquility of soul is virtuous and happy. That's how mindful he was in composing this virtuous life and achieving a version of his ideals. And I must share this incredible exhortation that Quincy Adams has in 1839 on the Jubilee of the Constitution and the Declaration. And he's afraid, it's a time much like today. Polarization is so great, it looks like the country is going to break apart. And Quincy Adams says the only thing that will save us is learning about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And he's a great Hebraicist, and he reads Deuteronomy in the original, and he says, this is worth getting exactly, but he says a version of this. He says, these principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, put them as frontlets between your eyes. whisper them to your children before you go to bed. Exhort them to your fellow citizens. Make them the principles of your political salvation. That's how intense he is about the need for Americans to learn about these principles for our own self-mastery and to save the country. And every time I feel like browsing or watching a spare YouTube video that I shouldn't, I think of John Quincy Adams and try to do some more deep reading because he's so inspiring.
So go from John Quincy Adams' evolution on the abolition of slavery to Thomas Jefferson and his great contradiction of trying to live a virtuous life, yet continuing to own slaves throughout his entire life.
Well, Jefferson read Cicero and read the same books and had the same philosophy of virtue as Adams, although at the end of his long life, Jefferson concludes, I am not a Stoic, but an Epicurean, by which he means not heedless or hedonism or pleasure-seeking, but the rational contraction of desires so that we can meet them. But he's so mindful about living a life of virtue. How is it possible that this sage could so flamboyantly and hypocritically betray his own principles? And what's so striking to learn in depth is he didn't even try. He and the other enslavers from Virginia are open in their moments of candor that slavery violates the Declaration of Independence and the Bible and natural law, but that they just don't want to give it up because they like the lifestyle. And there's this really striking and honest moment of candor from Patrick Henry, who's just given the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, quoting Cato's letters. And Henry says, is it not amazing that I myself, who think that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves, I will not justify it, I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed I can't do with the inconvenience of giving it up. You have to gasp at it, but it's a gasp of truth. It's okay, that's what it was. They knew it was horribly wrong, but they just didn't want to give it up. They didn't want to have the inconvenience. And Jefferson was the most flamboyant example of that because he is preaching industry and frugality, and yet he lives this Caligulan life at Monticello, where he creates this fantasy of a Palladian villa, and he's served by his own children. The people in his house are Beverly and Eustace Hemings, his children by Sally Hemings, who came back from Paris. She agreed to come back because he agreed to free their kids on his death. And he calls them his family and flatters himself that he's being, a kindly paterfamilias. And yet, although he's always insisting that slavery should end at some point in the distant future, he doesn't free his own enslaved population except his kids, even on his death. And they have to be broken up and parents are separated from kids in order to pay his debts. And the other thing that's so shocking about Jefferson is the depth of his racism. And I have a chapter on Phyllis Wheatley, the great first Black poet in America. She is brought over enslaved. She's given a classical education by her mistress, who lets her sit in on the lessons in Cicero and Seneca that the kids are having in the schoolroom. Based on a year of this education, as a teenager, she starts writing these poems of virtue and becomes acclaimed as one of the greatest poets of her age. And Washington praises her genius, and Benjamin Franklin receives her with respect, and she goes to England and she meets the Duke and Duchess, and she's what Professor Gates calls the Oprah Winfrey of her day. And who's the only dissenter? Jefferson. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, he has a whole chapter on how the poems of Phyllis Wheatley, or he calls her Whatley, are beneath contempt, basically because she's Black and Black people can't write good poetry. And it's such a shocking bit of racism or deep racism from the great champion of freedom of conscience and freedom of the mind. And it's just goes well beyond anything expressed by Washington or Madison or the other enslavers, or certainly by Franklin, who became an abolitionist. So all this is to say that on close examination, Jefferson becomes more troubling and not less. And yet, like all the others, he didn't attempt to defend slavery, but recognized that it was a form of great hypocrisy.
Wheatley could have stayed in England and stayed free and came back to the United States into slavery?
Yes, Somerset's decision by Lord Mansfield had just come down and seemed to suggest that presence in England would free you. And yet Wheatley also seems to have come over on a promise of freedom, which she received. So it was a bargaining chip, and that was one reason that she came back to the U.S.
So Jefferson lived by his 12 virtues, and as you talked about, had a reasonably disciplined way of living to it, of waking up in the morning and living his day. Franklin had 12 and added a 13th. 13th was humility. I want to go to John Adams on humility in a moment, but before we go to Adams on humility, let's stay with Franklin for a moment and his 12 turned to 13 list. You start the book with him, which said to me he was going to be the one that you thought, unlike John Quincy Adams, which I later saw you profiled him. But Franklin was a very virtuous man trying to achieve virtue in everything he did. He had great discipline. Talk for a moment about why he was in such quest of being a virtuous person, given all of his great, great success. I mean, you talk in the book about here's a man who has got all of these lists of characteristics and what he's done to give to society. And yet he is, like the others, in this constant quest of being a better person.
It's incredible. And it's such a good question. Why? And even when he's just starting in Philadelphia as a printer's apprentice, he starts this club for the United Party of Virtue, as he calls it. And he calls it the Junto. And it's basically a reading group for guys. And you're supposed to every week pick a different virtue and try to achieve it. And he gets the whole idea from John Locke, who in his essays on education recommends self-accounting and the pursuit of virtue as the core of education. And that's why Franklin makes this list of 13 virtues, including temperance, prudence, order, industry, and he saves humility for last. And turning to Pythagoras, because he's so practical, is just trying to operationalize it. It's basically applied Pythagorean virtue accounting. And he suggests that every night you put an X mark next to the virtue where you've fallen short. He tries this for a while. He finds it's incredibly depressing because there's so many X marks. And he gives it up for a while, but he thinks he's better for having tried. I know
you did that as well.
I did.
So talk for a moment about how well you were on tracking your virtues during the pandemic.
I mean, talk about synchronicities. About 10 years ago, a rabbi in D.C. at Adas Israel Synagogue suggested that a friend and I, Frank Ford, try this system of Hebrew character accounting called Musar, which means character, and it includes 13 virtues. And we didn't realize that it came from Franklin. And in fact, there was a Hasidic rabbi in 1808 who was an admirer of Franklin who translated his virtues into Hebrew, and they survive till today as this Musar system, forgetting or not understanding that it all went back to Franklin. We tried it for a while, and it's unbelievably depressing. I mean, just think imagine if tonight you were going to make an X mark if you'd fallen short of temperance. Every time you lose your temper, you have to do an X mark, which reminds how rigorous this self-accounting is, because it's a minute by minute thing. It's not just a generic, I'm going to try to be a good person today. It's, I can't lose my temper, or order, or cleanliness. Any one of them is so hard to achieve. But it is useful just to be mindful about it. For me, I guess as for Franklin too, what's even more important than the daily accounting is the spiritual framework about why it's so important. And for Franklin, as for all the others, recognizing that it was necessary to be self-mastered in order to lead a good life and to not only be healthy, wealthy, and wise, because Franklin was so practical that it'll make you good in business, but also to be a good person, and that being a good person will ultimately make you a good citizen, is something that he got from his deep reading in moral philosophy and from reading, his reading in Christian sermons as well, and others got it in different places. But it's worth pausing for a second. How is it possible, as you said, that this great man, the most famous man in the world next to Voltaire, who at the end of his life is acclaimed for having tamed the Gulf streams and brought lightning from the heavens, what did he attribute his great success to? He said his temperance, his conciliating temperament, that led him never to be too tendentious in asserting his opinions. He would never say, this is the way it is, my way or the highway, but always, it may be so, or I think perhaps it's this way. And that's what he said led him at the Constitutional Convention to convince both warring sides to make it unanimous. This isn't perfect, he said. It's not what I might have drafted, but it's as good as we're going to get, and I think it's as close to perfection as possible. And that's what led him to thrive during the Revolution, and it's what allowed him to continue his extraordinary productivity and curiosity and lifelong learning. So I think the point is, and it's important to see these as practical virtues. They're not. We're not actually trying to be like Jesus or Socrates in one swoop, but just, I mean, today we'd call it mindfulness, which is why there's such deep connections between the Eastern and Western wisdom traditions. But Franklin thinks that a version of what some people today would consider meditation or other forms of mindfulness, and just being aware of each moment of the day, and in particular, how you use time. It's so urgently important to be mindful about each moment and to structure the day so that you're not getting distracted by unproductive emotions and are focused on productive work. And there's that phrase, Justice Ginsburg.
Yeah.
Her mom told me that the best advice her mom gave her was avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They are not productive, and they'll distract you from productive work. And just RBG's mom got it from reading the Stoics in things like the McGuffey Reader and the readers that she read on the Lower East Side of New York when she was a young schoolgirl. But it's the ancient wisdom that by being completely focused on basically being your best self every moment of the day, you can use your own talents to the best of their abilities, and in doing so, best achieve your potential and also serve others. So, it's taking me a moment to describe it, but this sensibility that Franklin is embodying in his virtue project, self-mastery, self-reliance, character improvement, is the basic moral lesson of the ages that was so central to his education, went all the way up through American education for so long, and oddly sort of fell out of the discourse not so long ago.
So I've got about 15 questions out of what you just said. I'm going to try and work through them as quickly as I can, and I'm going to answer a couple myself. The first is his last book before this one was on Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Highly recommend it to anyone in the room. The second thing is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg married Lauren and Jeff, as a little aside that you might not have known. The next thing I wanted to talk about, Jeff, was Franklin's. In the book, you write that Franklin learned that raising his voice didn't get him any further in an argument, and he actually learned how to tone his voice down to have greater influence over people. In the world we live in today, where it seems like everyone's just turning the volume up as loud as they possibly can. Really interesting on that. Let's go back to Franklin on his 13th, which was humility, and go to John Adams, because your chapter on humility, you put Adams in there, which is somewhat ironic because he was the one who struggled with humility the most.
Yes, Franklin said he found it hardest to achieve. A Quaker friend told him he had to work on it, and he put it in there. And of course, it is the hardest to achieve. It has to do with mastering your ego, which is the central task. And it's those ego-based unproductive emotions, anger, jealousy, and fear. How dare they? Don't you know who I am? That you've got to, that it's the essence of wisdom to achieve. And Adams is the most famously self-regarding man of his age. And he's always storming that he's not getting enough credit for the Declaration of Independence. And as we all know from the musical 1776, I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied. He's constantly full of ego. He's mocked as his rotundity, or his, because he wants the president to be called his elective majesty and so forth. But the most endearing thing about Adams is he knows it. He's so relatable, as we would say today, because he's aware of the fact that this is his vice. And when he and Abigail are courting, they decide to make a list of each other's faults. Not a great dating strategy. Where do they get it? From Pythagoras. They're both reading the golden virtues, and they think, make a list of your faults. So Abigail is very generous to John, and she says, some call you arrogant, but in fact, it's just that you're so brilliant that people find you intellectually intimidating. And Adams's response is, well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed. And she's totally cool about it. She says, I'll try to read more, but a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. She takes it in stride. And then they have this gorgeous epistolary friendship and intellectual partnership and romance, and they're always exhorting each other to achieve self-improvement. not least, Abigail helps him master his temper, and she helps him make up after his two great battles with Thomas Jefferson and Mercy Otis Warren. Mercy Otis Warren, the brilliant anti-federalist. Adams calls her the poetical genius of the Revolution because she writes these satires on the Revolution, and they fall out over politics because she writes a history of the U.S. that's Jeffersonian and says that Adams is a monarchist who wants to set up a form of the English Constitution, and Adams loses it and says, "How dare you say I'm a monarchist and I'm arrogant?" And she said, "Well, you endorse the English Constitution." They break up for a while. Abigail sends a lock of her hair to bring them back together, and they reconcile because Adams knows about his faults. And in this great moment at the end, Mercy says, "I've just got one favor to ask. Some guy took the credit for my play, The Adulator, which you said was the best play of the Revolution. Can you attest that I wrote it?" He says, "You're the only genius who could have written it." He rides into Boston, goes to the Boston Athenaeum, goes to the title page where this other guy has taken credit for the play and crosses out the guy's name and says, "This was written by Mercy Otis Warren." And it's there in the Athenaeum today. You can see it. But it's a signal of he was arrogant, but always gained himself. And the other thing I have to share, it's so inspiring to see John Adams and Jefferson talking about books when they're old. What do they want to do when they reconcile? Talk about the books they've read. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled to the East and read the Bhagavad Gita and the Hindu Vedas. Wow, can you imagine? This is what he wants to do at the age of 80 or something. But there's only one problem. He's not sure that Joseph Priestley has lived long enough to write his book comparing the moral philosophy of the Christians and the Hindus, as they're called. And Jefferson says, "Good news, he lived. Here's the book. I'll send it to you." And Adams says, "This will prove that the central lesson of Pythagoras can be traced back to the East, and that's love God and his creatures, rejoice in all things." It's a version of renounce and enjoy. And Adams also notes the deep connections between the wisdom of the East and the West. It's just so exciting, isn't it? And so humbling to see you're all lifelong learners and I want to be too. Let's, when we're 80 years old, be like that and looking for those connections and seeking out the books and being excited by the similarities rather than the differences. And here's the other thing that's so inspiring. Adams had to worry about whether someone lived long enough to translate the Bhagavad Gita. For us nowadays, it's all online. It's all on our phones. And it just blows my mind that I was able to do this whole reading project and write this whole book sitting on my couch at home because all of the books are on this device. And all I need is the self-discipline to read them. So
the self-discipline not to go to that in the morning and check emails and do social media before doing your reading. No, but Jeff talks about that. I mean, you talk about creating that discipline of waking up in the morning and reading first and not going to that. Have you maintained that discipline?
Yes, I have. This is the crucial takeaway. If there's got to be a takeaway, and it's all about rules because that's what Pythagoras and Franklin teach. Habits and rules are crucial. So my rule now is I wake up early. I'm not always making the sunrise now. I must fess up. I don't want to be a virtue monger and pretend that every single morning I'm waking up for the sunrise. But I do have a rule that I have to read at least until breakfast rather than browse, and that requires picking up the phone because I do read online and just not being allowed to swipe left to email or to the blogs or whatever, and instead having to read a book. And it's hard because I really would rather in the morning check my email than read a book. So every morning it's a bit of a struggle, but because it's a rule, I'm keeping to it. And as a result, I'm still reading a lot. And it's so exciting that, remember, I felt that feeling I had as a kid. All the books are in this place. And I still get excited as I'm sharing this with you now. They're just all here. And there's so much wisdom and learning, but you got to have a habit. And for me, it has to be the same time of day. So the morning is the golden time to try to do the reading. And that's what I'm doing. And I'm writing another book and reading a lot of books for it. And it's just, I'm so glad to have developed the habit.
So on his deathbed, Peter Jefferson looks at Thomas Jefferson and says to him, get a classical education and maintain physical fitness. The real focus on your book is deep reading, continuous learning, lifelong learning. But when I read that, you're in good shape. As it relates to the discipline of reading and lifelong reading, on the other side of it, Jefferson was someone who also, and many of the founding fathers, took care of themselves physically as well. This all plays into this virtue and the discipline. Talk for a moment about that piece to it. Did you think about looking at them on that side as far as their physical health as well as their mental health as you were doing this research?
Completely. They're all about schedules and all about the same time of day for everything. And they also talk constantly about the times that they set aside for exercise and for meals and what they eat. And they're always making accounting there. And Jefferson has advice about on hikes, you should not bring a book so that you can focus on nature. He does say you can bring a gun. so I think hunting he thinks is okay, but it's very important to commune with nature and clear the mind and not be focusing on other things. And he is, he breaks his wrist at the end, but he's really horseback riding until the end. Washington keeps up his schedule. Washington's obsessed with clocks, which he gets from Seneca. Seneca has this great essay on time to his friend Lucilius. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be. The Shakespeare line comes from Seneca. And Washington has breakfast and lunch and tea and dinner at the same time every day. He basically eats the same thing every day, corn cakes in the morning and a hearty lunch and a light dinner. And he also is very keen on exercise. And the whole sound mind and sound body, which comes from the Greeks, is not just some lifestyle choice. It's central to the Pythagorean schedule of self-mastery. They took naps as well and scheduled those in there as well. So attention to eat, sleep, diet, discipline, time is all part of the package.
I was on a hike this morning getting ready for this conversation, and I had my ear pods in my ears listening to Jeff in an interview. And I heard the part about Jefferson saying, when you're on a hike, you should be focusing on nature and nothing else. And I go, I think he'll excuse me for going away from that right here. Jeff, let's go to when you read the book, there's this wistful sense that our leaders today don't have the qualities that the founding fathers had. That the people that we have is wistful an okay word? But there's a sense when you read it, and by the way, you do point out some of the inconsistencies with Jefferson, for instance. But first of all, this morning I woke up and I was thinking about this, and I wrote I won't use their names, but two senators and one governor, and said, "What are you reading right now?" And all three came back to me within 2 hours telling me what they were reading. One of them on a book on Iceland, the other one a book on history, but they all read. Okay. And I won't tell you what parties they were in, but they're all in one party. So my question to you, Jeff, is this. As you did this research and you think about where we are today, let me back up for 2 seconds. You mention in the book a memorandum or a note that Jefferson wrote about a president who would lose an election. You take it from here.
He gets the Constitution from Madison because he's been in Paris, and he has two objections. First, there's no Bill of Rights. And second, there's no term limits for the president. And he's worried that in the distant future, a president will lose an election by a few votes, cry foul, refuse to leave office, enlist the states who voted for him to support him, and install himself as a dictator. This gentleman is covering his face. And Hamilton has a similar fear from the other side. He's afraid that a president will be like a Caesar on horseback who will win an election and voluntarily persuade the people to install him as a dictator for life. They're centrally concerned about demagogues. And their fear of demagogues comes from their concerns about democracy, because neither of them are in favor of unmediated direct democracy. And they've been reading the ancients, and they have absorbed the wisdom that in all large assemblies, as Madison said, of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. And that's why the whole Constitution is set up to slow down deliberation, to prevent mobs or factions from forming based on passion rather than reason. Remember that distinction that comes back from Pythagoras? Bless you. It defines not only their notion of personal self-government, but political self-government. Individuals have to balance passion and reason in the constitution of their minds, and democracies have to do it in the constitution of the state. And unless they do that, then we'll form factions, which are any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And that's why the whole system is set up to separate powers vertically and horizontally, to slow down deliberation, to prevent mobs or factions from forming, and assume that by the time they do, because it's hard to make decisions, people will get tired and go home. So it's central to the political psychology of the Constitution. And I came to understand the Federalist Papers in a totally new light as a manual for public happiness, which is a phrase that Madison and Jefferson repeatedly use. At the end of their lives, none of them is sure that the experiment will succeed. And the major founders often express grave concern about whether or not the people will find enough virtue to keep the republic. And by virtue, now I understand, it's not some generic, being good in the abstract. It's the self-discipline and self-mastery not to tweet ourselves to death, not to let our most angry, factionate, own the libs and own the conservatives impulses define our need to compromise and to listen and to moderate ourselves. And Washington is afraid that we may descend into factions. Jefferson fears a civil war. Madison and Hamilton thinks the republic isn't strong enough to stop factions from forming. Only Madison is a little more optimistic. But what's the cause of his optimism? These new media technologies like the broadside press that will allow complicated arguments like the Federalist Papers to be distributed in newspapers. So a class of enlightened journalists and statesmen he calls the literati will persuade citizens to read. And by reading these arguments, to listen to different perspectives and to deliberate and eventually to converge around reason rather than passion. So that's why it's such a challenging time, because obviously our world of Instagram and X or whatever it's called, or Facebook, is the opposite of the Federalist Papers and the slow birth of reason. And that's not, and I have to say, in terms of politics, I'm not allowed anymore to have any political opinions, because I have the great privilege of working at the National Constitution Center, which is set up by Congress to be this nonpartisan center for constitutional education. And our chairs are Justice Breyer, who's here, and Justice Gorsuch. And we bring together liberals and conservatives to debate and educate people about the Constitution. And it's so inspiring to be part of this great mission for constitutional education. So it's not it's not a question of favoring one candidate or another, but it's obviously true that people on both sides, as you said, are not expressing themselves with the thoughtfulness, moderation, and depth of the founders. Why is that? It's not just because they don't read, because as you said, many people do, and in fact, the newly chosen vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, is certainly a deep student of American history and reads deeply, as do many others in public life. It must be the incentives of politics, and it must have to do with the social media environment that encourages you to play to your base and make the most extreme and radicalized statements in order to mobilize extremists on one side or the other, because there's no longer an incentive to move to the middle and to compromise. And it also has to do with the polarized state of our politics, which reflects this polarized social media landscape. And in that sense, you could say it's vindicating some of the founders' fears about the excesses of unmediated democracy. They're very much for republicanism, which means that ultimately the people have to decide, but it's a question of cooling the popular will. And here's the other thing that's so central. It's resisting the immediate impulse and taking the long view. That's basically the definition of virtue. When you sum up all of the wisdom literature, it's a version of the marshmallow test. Remember those kids at Stanford? If you want the one marshmallow, you're 7 years old, now you get one. If you can wait 15 minutes, you get two. And the kids who could wait did much better later in life. And that's what the Bhagavad Gita and the Dhammapada and John Locke and Cicero are all saying. Resist the immediate gratification or pleasure and just reflect, so that you can serve your long-term interests. And that's what immediate democracy by polling or Twitter polls don't do. And that's what, a republic or a constitutional democracy does achieve. So it's a very serious challenge. It's not just the leaders' fault because they're responding to the incentives of the system, but how we're going to get out of it is a great challenge.
Jeff clearly went for the 2 marshmallows.
Huh. I don't
Very
think I
clearly
did
went for the
actually.
2
No, I
marshmallows.
did not. I always go for the first mark.
As you went through that and about the need to pause, it reminds me in the book you talk about Jefferson, where you said, if you get angry, count to 10. If you get really angry, count to 100.
Yeah.
And we all probably could learn a little bit from that, particularly in the tweet world that we live in today. I guess one of the things as I listen to you, and by the way, how about Jeff, like in that response, he's quoting directly from the Constitution, from the great Greek and Roman philosophers, and also pulling it all together in something perfectly articulated. To be that smart and have your brain running that fast.
No.
The National Constitution Center, for a second, let's dive into that, because you talked about it being bipartisan, it chartered by the federal government, but now privately funded, very little funding from the federal government. But you have a podcast every week called We the People, where you're extremely good at bringing in both sides of the debate, both sides of the issue. And you have incredible scholars and judges and all sorts of people to take both sides. As you've been at the National Constitution Center, Jeff, defending that document, have you felt yourself moving more towards, if you will, Ruth Bader Ginsburg of it should be a living document that gets reinterpreted over time, or more towards Antonin Scalia that we need to look at the actual words of the Constitution and hold on to them from a traditionalist standpoint?
I'd say I'm not allowed to have opinions. I've lost interest in my own opinions, and it's much.
But we're very interested in your opinions.
Look,
we're very interested in how this job has influenced
I'm
you.
not being coy here. Every week I have to call up the most, these great scholars and thinkers to give the arguments on both sides of all the cases. And we did the Trump immunity case last week, and in 2 episodes. First, it was Harold Koh from Yale Law School and a group of scholars who were more inclined to think it was a 5-alarm fire, as Justice Jackson said. And then we had 2 conservative scholars, all of different perspectives. In each of these cases, they disagreed slightly, but they were much more, this is within the scope of previous immunity decisions and will not transform the world. And the more you listen to different thoughtful people on both sides, the harder it is to be sure of yourself. That spirit that's not too sure it's right, as Learned Hand puts it, comes from just taking the time to listen to arguments on both sides. But I will say this, it's so inspiring, it's so elevating, it's so meaningful to just learn from all of these wonderful perspectives every week, and to convene groups of people to do this, to teach learners of all ages, especially kids. And it's so exciting to have created this new Constitution 101 class, which is now online, and we're going to launch in just a few weeks with Khan Academy. It's Khan Academy's first civics course. They've never done one before, so we'll bring it to high school students at scale with the great liberal and conservative scholars and for teachers and high school kids. And then we're going to do a middle school version, and I'm also committed to inspiring adult learners like you to engage in this great project of lifelong constitutional education. So now I'm going to just plug the incredible interactive Constitution, which is now online and it's free. And it's now gotten 80 million hits since we launched in 2015. It's among the most Googled constitutions in the world. And you can click on any clause of the Constitution and again, find the leading liberal and conservative scholars writing 1,000 words about what they agree the provision means, and then separate statements about what they disagree about. So just as Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Katyal, with 1,000 words about what they agree about the habeas corpus clause, and then separate statements about what they disagree. It just blows my mind. 80 clauses, 160 scholars, so much learning and light, and so it's so deep and rigorous, and you can't believe that any of these questions is simple once you see how thoughtfully people agree and disagree, and that, plus the podcasts and the classes and primary source documents. I really believe in this marvelous age of learning that we can create the resources that can allow citizens of all ages just to learn and to dig in and to teach themselves. So the Constitution is made for people of fundamentally differing points of view, as Justice Holmes said. And throughout history, the lines between liberal and strict construction and national and state power have gone up and down. That's part of the American experiment. But it's both elevating and consoling to some degree to realize that although we've come very close to civil war more than once, violence has pervaded our history. We've betrayed our ideals dramatically throughout our history. The arc has bended upward because people have been committed to the conversation and because the Constitution itself has provided a framework that has structured our disagreements.
Jeff talked about our Constitution and what he has online being viewed by people from all over the world. The National Constitution Center actually gave President Zelensky the Liberty Award 2 years ago, and was a real shot in the arm to him at that time as it relates to trying to hold on to their nation under siege. You also gave the award to David Rubenstein and to Judy Woodruff, who has been a great participant and fan of the Sun Valley Writers Conference last year.
And we're giving it this year to the great Ken Burns, who I think is another friend out here. Please come. It's September 24th in Philly. And we're also working with Ken Burns for his amazing American Revolution documentary, which is going to launch next year, and are creating a series of a civic toolkit so that kids in schools can learn about the basic principles of the American idea as they watch the documentary. And it's just so exciting to be able to work with Ken Burns to teach the American idea. It's such a, these are very, very alarming and troubling times for politics, but it's exciting to be able to teach all this history and inspire people to learn about the best of America.
To any of you who haven't watched Ken Burns's commencement speech at Brandeis University this past May, you might want to take a look at that. It's a fantastic speech. Two final things. First of all, a lot of people felt that 2020 was a great testing of our system. You know our system and the laws of our system as well or better than anyone. Was that a true test, and are we prepared to be able to take another test?
It was a test. I don't know anyone, including defenders of President Trump, who doesn't say that January 6th, the riots themselves were wrong, and they were Madison's nightmare. The fear of armed mobs surrounding federal courthouses was literally what led to the Constitutional Convention and Shays' Rebellion. And the fear of subverting the Republican system through violence is exactly what the whole Constitution was set up to avoid. The system did hold. The vice president did not certify the false results, and all 80 judges who considered the question, those appointed by President Trump and other presidents, all rejected the false claims. And the winner took office. So the system held. I don't know what the future will bring. It's so extraordinary to see how fate turns, as we have been reminded this week on a gesture, or a bullet, or a breath, or a fate. Small contingencies can transform history, and it's fragile. And war came in the 1860s because the Constitution did not hold. So, and the wisest thing that President Trump ever says is, "We'll see." That's all we can say. I
will say one thing, which is, I opened my conference earlier this week, and I did say, thank God that President Trump was not shot and killed. Thank God, because I said to everyone who was here, you may not be here. What would be going on in the streets of America right now had that happened? And so I think we all have to remember that. The other thing was, I had Dawn Staley, who's the women's basketball coach at the University of South Carolina, come speak at our conference. And Dawn Staley, some of you may remember, she was in 3 Olympics, won 3 Olympic gold medals. And she was the flag bearer for the United States walking in to her final Olympics. And she talked about what an honor it was to carry that flag in. And I pointed out to people, we are all fighting to defend that same flag, left or right. The two sides view it as a more perfect union, but they are both fighting for that flag. And you must remember that neither side has the privilege to say, we believe in that flag more than the other, and that we all have to focus on that flag. My final question to you, your next project, it's Hamilton and Jefferson. and the differences between the two of them as it relates to having states power or federal power. Talk for a second about that and how happy one of them would have been on the outcome on Roe.
Huh. Hamilton, Jefferson, the battle for the soul of America, 1776 to 2026. It's the most obvious of all historical subjects and the most exciting to work through because it's so powerful. Hamilton and Jefferson are like golden and silver threads woven throughout American history, and their initial battle between national power and states' rights and liberal versus strict construction and rule by elites versus rule by democracy has defined all of our political and constitutional battles ever since. And half the book just tells their story, the incredible clash over the bank and the finance system and the Alien Sedition Acts and the profound differences in their political philosophies, in particular their approach to national power. And then I just trace how each of them is invoked at every major moment in American history by Lincoln, who before the Civil War says all honor to Jefferson and insists that resisting secession is crucial to preserving the Union, against Calhoun, who's invoking Jefferson to justify secession, and FDR, who has the chutzpah is the only word, to paint himself as a great Jeffersonian, even as he's expanding federal power in ways that Jefferson would have recoiled from. Ronald Reagan reinvokes Jefferson to try to strike back the New Deal, and it pledges to appoint Jeffersonian justices who will abide by original understanding. And that's the whole basis for our current debates about federal power. The clash between the Jeffersonian Clarence Thomas, who believes in the Declaration, and the more Hamiltonian Justice Scalia, who believed in original understanding but wanted to defer to the federal government like the administrative state and would have upheld that Chevron decision that the Supreme Court just overturned last week because he thought that executive power was more important than constraining Congress. So it's just a marvelous and dramatic way of studying American intellectual, political, and constitutional history. And it's so exciting for me to trace it through. Roe is Jeffersonian in the sense that it returned power to the states rather than the federal government. On the other hand, so many of these decisions would have made Jefferson cringe because they're all about judicial supremacy and the extraordinary vision of a court, a U.S. Supreme Court, immunizing the president or striking down environmental protections would have appalled Jefferson because he thinks that the president isn't even bound to obey the Supreme Court and views John Marshall as a miner and saper who's trying to undermine the Constitution. But basically, he believes in democracy above all and doesn't think that judges should strike down any unconstitutional laws. What this shows is both Jefferson and Hamilton are protean figures, to use a phrase that one scholar has said, and different sides have invoked Jefferson or Hamilton at different times based on whether their stock is high or low and also to, justify their political results. But there is something majestic and inspiring about the fact that our history has been defined by a battle of ideas. And even though all sides have often betrayed their principles, at least they've had these great principles to betray and also to march for. And it's so, you think about why are we fighting for democracy? Why must we be committed to preserving it? We've got to preserve it because the ideals are so inspiring. Liberty, equality, democracy, freedom of conscience, natural rights, all of these ideals of the Constitution and Declaration, which Hamilton and Jefferson shares, are the right ideas. They're self-evident truths. It is self-evidently true that we are all created equal and born by our Creator with these glorious rights, and we do form government to secure these rights, and we've created the greatest experience in self-government ever, the only written constitution still surviving. It's urgently important to preserve it. And I guess now that I'll finish up this 4th of July speech by saying the way to preserve it is to listen and to deliberate and to remember Franklin and the spirit we're not too sure that we're right and not my way, the highway. It's virtuous self-mastery, calm, temperance, moderation, prudence, courage, fortitude, justice. Let's just remember those virtues. They'll make us better citizens. And at the very least, in these anxious, challenging, difficult times, they'll make us happier people.